By definition, a storyteller conveys events in words, images, and sounds, often by improvisation or embellishment. The Living Bread Radio Network presents The Storytellers with Tony Agnesi. Today you'll hear a faith-based, inspirational story that's both heartfelt and heartwarming. And now, let's meet today's storyteller with Tony Agnesi.
Hi, this is Tony Agnesi, and welcome to this edition of The Storytellers. We're heard every Tuesday at 2 o'clock with a repeat on Sundays at 9 a.m. right here on the Living Bread Radio Network. And the program is also available as a podcast beginning at 2:30, right after the show, at thestorytellersradio.com. It's also available wherever you get your podcast, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, YouTube, TuneIn Radio, and now on Spotify. It's also available later in the week at the Catholic podcasting site, breadboxmedia.com. Our program is sponsored in part by catholicbook.net, and all of the books featured on the program are available through catholicbook.net. Now, each week on the show, we feature a guest and discuss their personal journey of faith and the ministries that they share as either authors or speakers or bloggers or radio and television hosts. And today's guest is certainly no exception to that. He's a storyteller, to be sure. Kevin Lowry is a convert to the Catholic faith and has spent over 20 years in finance and executive management. He's got a brand new book out called How God Hauled Me Kicking and Screaming into the Catholic Church, and that's available now. He served as the Chief Operating Officer of the Coming Home Network for several years and is now Chief Financial Officer for Rev Local, a rapidly growing digital marketing company. He and his wife live in Columbus, Ohio. They have 8 children. And Kevin, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Tony.
I was fascinated when I saw your book online being promoted, and you always wonder. You think of people coming into the faith after something magnificent happens, and all of a sudden they're drawn to the faith. Kicking and screaming is not often heard. Tell us a little bit about your growing up years and your faith story.
Sure. Well, I was very fortunate, very blessed, I would say, to grow up in a small town near Toronto, Canada, and I have just the most wonderful parents. My dad was a Presbyterian minister, among other things, and I've got just a terrific mom, and so I was raised in a very faithful home. My dad, when I was a kid, was in business for a while. He was a professor, but he was also in full-time ministry for quite some time. And he was not only the minister of the local Presbyterian Church, but he was also the clerk of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. So I got to see him really, living out the faith. He and my mom both. And just had a terrific childhood. Played hockey as much as I possibly could. But then when it came to graduating from high school and figuring out what to do next, I took a look around, and I was awfully young at the time. I graduated when I was only 16. And I decided that, my dad decided that we should take a look at a small Catholic college called Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. And I thought that this would be a marvelous opportunity to get away for a couple days on a road trip with my dad and to go down and see what Ohio was like because, I'd spent all my life up in Canada. Mm-hmm. So we did that. We took this road trip. I got a couple days off of school, and we went down to Franciscan U. And my dad really appreciated the spiritual aspects of the school and thought it would be a great place for me to go because I was in a very rebellious period of my life. And for my part, I connected with a bunch of guys with these really cool red T-shirts on that said TKE on the front. Mm-hmm. And they took me out and showed me a great time and frankly got me completely blasted the first night that I was there. And I thought this was the greatest place on earth. I thought, man, this is exactly where I want to go. And I'm going to join this fraternity, and I'm going to have a great time. So that's exactly what happened. I had a great time. I joined the fraternity, I didn't go to class much, and within 3 semesters, I was kicked out.
Sounds a little bit like my college days. I noticed you majored in beer and billiards. I majored in beer and pinochle, so we were similar in part of that.
That's right. Well, I have to say, that was actually my dad who came up with that double major. He didn't realize it right away, but yeah, that was definitely the truth of it. But, thankfully, I went back up to Canada, and I think my humility was a little bit improved at that point, and I had to work. So I got a terrific entry-level job at Sony of Canada, and this was back, Sony is a very innovative, wonderful electronics company. So I had, the coolest TV and car stereo and everything else. But I had a really good experience in the business world, and sort of caught an enthusiasm for that, and decided by the time I was 21, I'd grown up a little bit and had developed a work ethic. But I decided that I wanted to be president of the company. And believe it or not, I had the audacity to tell the president of the company that, who I don't think was threatened at all. But I decided that I had to go back to college in order to make that work, because I thought that an MBA was the thing to do, because all the big shots at Sony had MBAs. So it occurred to me, of course, that I needed to finish my undergraduate degree first. So I started applying to schools, and much to my shock and amazement, the only place on the planet that would talk to me was Franciscan University of Steubenville, because my grades were so bad from the first time around that was the only place that I could go. So here I am, 21 years old. I'm re-entering college, and the second time around, by God's grace, a couple things happened. The first is I met the most beautiful American girl I've ever seen in my life, and she provided me with ample motivation to really do well in my studies. So that was great. And then the second part was that this beautiful American girl, who was also not Catholic, and I both had to take Catholic theology courses as part of our course of study. And I got to tell you, I took one course called ethics that I thought would be fairly benign, and they talked about this encyclical. And I said, well, what's an encyclical? I remember somebody telling me, well, it's something that the Pope wrote. I said, okay, what's it called? And they said, well, it's called Humanae Vitae. I said, well, what the heck is that all about? And it took me a little while, Tony, but I finally figured out they were talking about birth control. And, of course, as a Presbyterian, that was a complete non-issue, and I thought that they were crazy. I thought that this was a complete and utter waste of time. And what really rocked my world was when I started to learn more about all of these perspectives that I had never heard, that really started becoming intriguing and gradually, over the course of time, compelling. So, finally, the beautiful American girl and I graduated. We got through this course. We passed the class. We had to learn it well enough. And we really found ourselves saying, maybe these Catholics are onto something. So around that time, my dad came down and spent a year as a visiting professor at Franciscan, because he was still a Presbyterian minister at that point, but he also has a doctorate in business, so he taught in the business school. And during that time, I think he had a real great opportunity to sort of reconcile some of his own beliefs. And I would be calling him on a regular basis saying, hey, this is what they were saying in this class today. What do you think about this? And he would always have a very balanced perspective and say, well, here's the Protestant perspective on this, and here's the Catholic view. And more often than not, he would say, here's why the Catholic viewpoint actually makes a lot of sense. So in many ways, it was sort of inching gradually towards the church. But so I graduated from college, and the beautiful American girl and I got married. We moved to Cleveland, and we started having kids at a furious pace. Our first 3 kids were born in 2 years and 8 months. And my dad got invited to go and spend a week in the Vatican. And this is when Pope John Paul II was the Pope, St. John Paul II. And so he goes over to the Vatican and spends a week over there and has a private audience with St. John Paul II and is just completely blown away by the holiness that he finds in the people. And he made great friends with the late Cardinal John Foley, who was just a wonderful man, and they developed a lifelong friendship after that. But Cardinal Foley, I remember asking my dad, he said, why don't you become Catholic? And my dad came away from that feeling very deeply impacted and honored in the sense that he said, that's really the most precious thing that he could offer me. So all of this had just a tremendous impact on my dad, and he came back and he wrote an article about this experience in the Presbyterian Record, which was the denominational magazine of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And it came out with his picture on the front cover, shaking hands with the Pope. And all hell broke loose because there were people calling for heresy trials for my dad and trying to get him kicked out of the faith because he was obviously a very visible guy within the church, being the clerk of the General Assembly. And there were all kinds of people who were supportive, who were saying this is wonderful, it's ecumenical. But then one guy wrote in and he said, well, why doesn't Dr. Lowry just become Catholic? So at this point, some of the defenses started to crumble. And a friend of my dad's handed off a tape of a guy named Scott Hahn, who had come to Franciscan University the year after my dad was there as a visiting professor. And we listened to this tape together, and I'll never forget my dad turning to me at the end of this. And he looked at me and he said, I can't really argue with anything this guy's saying. And I think it was at that moment that I thought, you know what, I really need to look into this. So I decided to go through RCIA. And God bless my wife, she decided to come with me, even though she was, I think at that point, very deeply skeptical. And we ended up entering the church together, which was just a beautiful and blessed experience. And then the following year, my parents moved down to Steubenville on a permanent basis. My dad, in fact, taught at Franciscan for many, many years in the business department before retiring. And they came into the church together the following year.
You mentioned with Humani Vitae in some of the studies that you had to do, and you found the material compelling. Was there a particular moment, Kevin, a particular metanoia moment that you said, aha, and you began to seek out, you turned from, lukewarm to on fire, and you began to seek out and study?
Yeah, and I think, Tony, I don't think it was that class. I mean, there was sort of the small metanoia or change of heart within that class on that particular topic. But really, there were, at least within me, a lot of structural obstacles. So even though I began to acquire an appreciation for the thinking, the underpinnings, because, really what happened was I was presented with a lot of very compelling and cogent arguments for why birth control isn't the greatest thing since sliced bread, which I always thought that it was. And there was a cumulative effect almost of all of that, where I thought, again, originally I was like, these people are crazy, and then it just became sort of more and more interesting over the course of time as everything just sort of fell into place and made more and more sense. But I think that the true metanoia moment was that listening to that tape with my dad, because I had been struggling. I had this really almost a deep inner turmoil for a long time. I mean, this process for me took 10 years. And it was really, I think, at that moment that I thought, you know what, I need to look into this. And so, in fact, what I did was I called Scott, and I said, hey, I listened to your tape. Thanks very much. It's interesting stuff, and can we get together? I really want to talk to you. And I'm so grateful to Scott and of course his wife Kimberly, because we got our families together. We came down there. We went to Mass, which was, I think, the third time I had ever been to Mass in my life. And he pulled out this this pad of paper and started writing down the names of books. I remember one of them was Catholic and Christian by Dr. Alan Schreck, who's a wonderful man and a professor at Franciscan U as well, that did a really good job explaining some of the differences in the ways that Protestants and Catholics look at some of the same things. And so it was really, it was a very, very gradual sort of transformation over the course of time. Mm-hmm. And of course, the punchline is, I just can't express in words how much I love being Catholic. It's been, the greatest gift of my entire life. And obviously, we learned Humanae Vitae well enough that, as you said in the introduction, my wife and I ended up having 8 kids. Because not only did our appreciation of this consistent ethic of life come through, but our appreciation of children really grew. Where, I'm a business guy, and I had looked at them as economic liabilities in many ways, and now I look at them as unmitigated blessings. Mm-hmm. And I got to tell you, Tony, we're expecting our 4th grandchild right now, which is even better. It's the most amazing thing. Everything that they say about grandparenthood is true.
You betcha. You betcha. Kevin Lowry is my guest. His new book is How God Hauled Me Kicking and Screaming into the Catholic Church. When we get back on the Storytellers, we're going to zero in on Kevin's writing and his books and talk a little bit about more of his conversion story, but how he began to put this into writing when we return on the Storytellers.
Support for the Storytellers is provided by CatholicBook.net, serving the Catholic community for 30 years with books, Bibles, gifts, and more. CatholicBook.net is safe, secure, and simple to use. Just a few clicks and your purchase is delivered right to your door. CatholicBook.net. For 30 years, a commitment to service.
This is Tony Agnesi, and welcome back to the Storytellers. Today we're talking with Kevin Lowry, author of the book How God Hauled Me Kicking and Screaming into the Catholic Church. Kevin, we got a sense of that from what you've told us in the first segment of the show. What was the catalyst that said, I need to write this down?
Well, yeah, it's funny. I started being invited to give my conversion story at different places because I wrote it many years ago, and Pat Madrid, a wonderful guy and friend, published it in Envoy magazine originally, and then it came out as part of the book Surprised by Truth 2. So I started getting these invitations to share the story because just the enthusiasm that I had and continued to have for the faith was just something that I really needed to unleash a little bit. And then at some point, my first book is called Faith at Work, Finding Purpose Beyond the Paycheck. Because, again, with my dad's background, this is the stuff we talked about at the dinner table. Mm-hmm. It was business and what's going on this board that he's on and what's going on at the office, and then at the same time, the ministry. And so that sort of naturally came about. But then after that, what I was really shooting for with the latest book is to give something that would be of an encouragement to faithful Catholics, but at the same time in a non-confrontational way, but really as just a friend would talk to a friend, be able to illustrate to some of my non-Catholic friends why it was so compelling to become Catholic and why this is the greatest gift that I've ever been given, and why I'm so deeply grateful for this experience, because it's been transformational in every aspect of life.
Mm. There are a lot of, and obviously we're both well aware of what's going on with the loss of attendance at Mass and in not only in the Catholic Church but in the mainline Protestant denominations as well. There are an awful lot of guys majoring in beer and billiards in college, and a book like this, I think, in my opinion, has the ability to maybe capture somebody's attention enough to at least cause them to say that they might need to think about this because of the compelling way in which you present it. Is that kind of the underpinning of why you'd want this book out? And have you gotten any feedback from the guys who say, well, you just described me?
Well, yes, and thank you. You've actually said it very well right there. I have gotten great feedback from people who have read it and who have said, I've had calls from people who have entered the church, and this, the book, By the Grace of God, was the catalyst. But the thing that I was really after, you used a word earlier that I love, which is metanoia, that change of heart, because really conversion is rarely sort of the Saul on the road to Damascus. Mm-hmm. It's rarely that abrupt. It's more often than not, it's a process that happens over the course of time. Mm-hmm. And it's not like it's not an event. It is an event, but it's a series of events. Mm-hmm. And so, we plant seeds, or we have seeds planted within us, and then by the grace of the Holy Spirit, those seeds sprout and flourish. And so that's what I was really hoping, was that this book would help plant seeds within people, and they may not agree with everything that I say, and that's fine. I'm okay with that. I'm not right all the time anyway. Just ask my wife. But there's hopefully a story there that they can follow, that they understand. I tried to write it with a deep spirit of humility, because I did a lot of stupid things on the way in, and I sort of think about those stupid things as a microcosm of what's going on in the church. I mean, of course there are bad things going on in the church. Frankly, I came in expecting some of that, because when you read and you do a lot of research and look at the church's history, it's fraught with all kinds of sinfulness of the members, because that's who we are. We're all fallen, sinful people. And it's been like that since the beginning. So there have been popes who have been terrible people. There's been all kinds of bad stuff. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the Holy Spirit has always used the church over the course of time, and there have always been saints. And I think St. Augustine has some great quotes about this, and how God can bring good even out of evil. So I remain just firmly hopeful that even through the difficulties, yes, in the church, they exist, but more than that, the difficulties and the sinfulness within ourselves, if you think about it, even that can be overcome, and where else can you get that? This is one of the reasons why, just one very practical example of why I love being Catholic. Mm-hmm. It's because of confession. I think confession is the greatest thing on earth. Mm-hmm. Confession is conversion. It's the most incredible thing, because if you think about it, the God who created us also created the sacraments for us, because he knew that it's better to go before a minister of his, an agent, if you will, who says to you verbally, that I forgive you. I mean, it rocked my world, or your sins are forgiven. I mean, it's completely different than sitting in the corner of your room and looking upwards and saying, Jesus, please forgive me for my sins. Mm-hmm. So I think that those types of things within the Catholic Church, there are problems, but within it, we've been given the gifts and the tools that we need by virtue of the sacraments to become holy. And that's what we're really after at the end of the day.
You talked about conversion often being, for most people, I know it is in my case as well, an ongoing process. Something triggers it, and then you become a seeker, and then you start reading, and then you start discerning, and some of this material becomes more and more compelling, and the more you read, the more you want, and so forth. And I think, in my opinion, your book it would be a great starting point for somebody who, is ambivalent about the whole thing, might read the book, find something that starts that process, that just kind of kickstarts that process. It's I would say it's a great book to have in the back of the room when you're speaking somewhere, because I think that hearing you speak and hearing your enthusiasm might take someone an opportunity to read it and start that journey. And boy, I really think that's a great thing.
Well, from your lips to God's ear, Tony, because that's exactly right. I was hoping that when people bought one of these books, I was actually hoping that they would buy two, one for them and one to give away to somebody else.
We've just got a short period of time left. This has been great, Kevin, but faith at work, finding purpose beyond a paycheck. There are an awful lot of people who will say to me, Tony, how do you reconcile, work and your faith and the things you have to do, the dog-eat-dog world and doing it and remain Catholic and
Right.
And applying the basic tenets of your faith? Give us a couple of thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I wrote that book to encourage people that you don't have to go to work and beat people over the head with a catechism in order to be faithful and effective at both work and essentially what comes down to evangelization. Mm-hmm. This is all about living the faith. And by living the faith, we should become both better at our work and more effective at our work and more effective as Catholics and in our lives. Because really the whole purpose of work is to help sanctify us. And, so I think that there's an enormous opportunity to use the challenges and the difficulties and the, all of the conundrums that we come across to grow in holiness and to affect this ongoing conversion that we're all a part of and that we're all striving for. The workplace, it's almost like it's tailor-made to help us down the path.
It sure is. Well, the books are Faith at Work, Finding Purpose Beyond the Paycheck, and Kevin Lowry's new book, How God Hauled Me Kicking and Screaming into the Catholic Church. Kevin, this has been a quick time together. I've really enjoyed it. God bless you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Tony. I really appreciate it.
And that's our show for today. My thanks go to Kevin Lowry, author of the book, How God Hauled Me Kicking and Screaming into the Catholic Church. It's available, as all of the books that we feature here, at catholicbooks.net. If you missed part of the program or want to hear it again, you can hear it this Sunday again at 9 a.m., and it's also available at thestorytellersradio.com, on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, YouTube, TuneIn Radio, and Spotify. This is Tony Agnesi. See you next week for another edition of The Storytellers. God bless you.
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Storytellers with Tony Agnesi, a production of the Living Bread Radio Network in Canton, Ohio. To learn more about today's storyteller, go to thestorytellersradio.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast and hear all of our past shows. And join us again next week at this same time for The Storytellers with Tony Agnesi.